Bullies try to go 2 versus 1 against the new kid. Big mistake. He was a brutal fighter. The Quiet Storm. Chapter 1. Invisible. The morning fog clung to the windows of Roosevelt High School like ghostly fingers, casting everything in a grey, muted light that seemed to match Ethan Cross's mood perfectly. He stood at the main entrance, watching streams of students flow past him with the practiced indifference of someone who had learned to become invisible. At 17, Ethan possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that allowed him to blend seamlessly into any crowd. Average height, lean but not skinny, with dark brown hair that perpetually fell across his forehead despite his attempts to push it back. His clothes, always clean but clearly second-hand, hung loosely on his frame, adding to the overall impression of someone trying very hard not to be noticed. It had been exactly 3 weeks and 2 days since his family had packed their entire life into a rented moving truck and driven from their small apartment in Riverside, California, to this rain-soaked corner of Oregon. 3 weeks and 2 days since his father, Miguel Cross, had announced with forced optimism that his transfer to the regional office of Pacific Northwest Insurance would be a fresh start for all of us. 3 weeks and 2 days since Ethan's world had been turned completely upside down, leaving him stranded in a place where he knew absolutely no one and understood none of the unspoken social rules that governed teenage existence. The transition hadn't been kind to any of them. His mother, Carmen, spent most evenings unpacking boxes with tears streaming down her face, though she tried to hide it whenever Ethan entered the room. His younger sister, Sophia, had thrown herself into her new middle school with the resilience that only 12-year-olds seemed to possess, already making friends and joining the drama club. But Ethan found himself caught in that particular kind of limbo reserved for high school transfers. Too old to easily make new friends, too young to simply wait it out until graduation. As he adjusted the worn straps of his backpack, Ethan caught his reflection in the glass doors and grimaced. The dark circles under his eyes told the story of another sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if things would ever feel normal again. Back in California, he'd had friends. Not many, but a solid group of guys who appreciated his dry sense of humor and didn't mind that he preferred reading comic books to playing video games. Here, he was starting from zero, and every day felt like an exercise in social archaeology, trying to decode the complex hierarchies and alliances that had been forming since these kids were in elementary school together. What none of his new classmates could possibly know, what Ethan worked very hard to keep hidden beneath his carefully cultivated aura of harmless mediocrity, was that he had spent the last 8 years learning how to fight. Not the kind of sloppy, emotional brawling that occasionally broke out in school parking lots, but the precise, calculated violence of mixed martial arts. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, and all day Saturday, he had trained under the watchful eye of his Uncle Ray, his father's younger brother, who had spent 6 years as a professional fighter before a torn ACL ended his career and sent him into coaching. Uncle Ray's gym, Warrior's Path Mixed Martial Arts, had been Ethan's second home since he was 9 years old. The smell of sweat and rubber mats, the rhythmic sound of heavy bags being pummeled, the quiet intensity of fighters pushing their bodies to their absolute limits. It had all become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Under Ray's guidance, Ethan had learned not just how to throw punches and execute takedowns, but how to read an opponent's intentions in the micro-expressions that flickered across their face, how to control his breathing under pressure, how to turn his opponent's aggression into a weapon against them. But more importantly, Ray had drilled into him the philosophical side of martial arts, the discipline, the restraint, the understanding that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when violence was necessary and when it was simply ego. Fighting isn't about proving you're tough, Ray would say during their cool-down sessions, his scarred hands wrapped around a cup of coffee as steam rose between them. Any idiot can throw a punch. Real fighting is about protecting what matters when everything else fails. And most of the time, son, the best way to win a fight is to never have it in the first place. That philosophy had served Ethan well at his old school, where his quiet confidence and obvious reluctance to engage in drama had earned him a reputation as someone not worth bothering. He had hoped the same approach would work here, but 3 weeks of careful observation had taught him that Roosevelt High operated by different rules. This was a bigger school, with more clearly defined social strata and an administration that seemed either unable or unwilling to address the subtle forms of harassment that flew under the radar of official anti-bullying policies. And unfortunately, some people had a talent for spotting vulnerability, even when it was carefully hidden. Well, what do we have here? The voice belonged to Blake Harrison, a senior whose physical presence seemed to command attention from everyone within a 50-foot radius. Blake stood an inch over 6 feet, with the kind of broad shoulders and thick neck that suggested hours spent in the weight room, though Ethan suspected his impressive physique had more to do with genetics than actual athletic ability. His dirty blonde hair was styled with expensive product into the kind of perfectly messy look that probably took him 20 minutes to achieve each morning. And his clothes, always designer brands, always impeccably clean, marked him as someone whose family had money and wasn't shy about displaying it. But it was Blake's eyes that truly set him apart from the typical high school tough guy. Cold, calculating, and perpetually amused, they held the kind of intelligence that made him genuinely dangerous. This wasn't some mindless bully who acted out of insecurity or poor impulse control. Blake Harrison was a predator who had turned psychological manipulation into an art form, and he surrounded himself with carefully chosen allies who served specific functions in his personal ecosystem of dominance. Standing slightly behind Blake and to his right was Connor Mills, his constant companion and most trusted lieutenant. Where Blake was broad and imposing, Connor was lean and wiry, with sharp features that reminded Ethan of a hunting knife, all angles and edges designed for maximum damage with minimal effort. His dark hair was buzzed short on the sides and longer on top, and his pale green eyes never seemed to rest, constantly scanning for weaknesses, opportunities, or threats to their carefully maintained social order. Ethan had been studying these two for the past several weeks, watching how they moved through the school like wolves working in perfect coordination. Blake was clearly the alpha, using his charisma and natural leadership abilities to gather followers and identify targets. Connor served as his scout and enforcer, the one who did the actual dirty work, while Blake maintained plausible deniability. Together, they had created a sphere of influence that extended throughout the junior and senior classes, built on a foundation of fear, admiration, and the kind of casual cruelty that thrived in environments where adults weren't paying close enough attention. For the past 2 weeks, they had been testing him. It had started small, the kind of harassment that could easily be dismissed as accidents or misunderstandings. Shoulder checks in the hallway that sent him stumbling into lockers. Comments made just loud enough for him to hear, but quiet enough to deny if questioned. The occasional accidental bump that sent his books flying across the floor. Each incident was carefully calibrated to push him toward a reaction while maintaining their own deniability. But Ethan recognized the pattern. He had seen it before, both in his old school and in the stories Uncle Ray had told him about his own teenage years. This was how predators operated. They tested their prey's responses, looking for signs of weakness or vulnerability that could be exploited later. The fact that Ethan had refused to rise to their bait had apparently only made them more determined to find his breaking point. "Still playing the strong, silent type, I see," Blake continued, stepping directly into Ethan's path as he tried to navigate toward his first period English class. The hallway around them began to slow, students instinctively sensing the shift in atmosphere that preceded confrontation. "That's cute, new boy, but it's getting old. Don't you think it's time you learned how to make friends?" Connor flanked him on the left side, completing the trap with practiced efficiency. "Yeah, man," he added, his voice carrying the kind of false friendliness that immediately set Ethan's nerves on edge. "We're starting to think you don't like us or something. That hurts our feelings, you know?" The students in the immediate area continued to flow around them like water around stones, most too absorbed in their own concerns to notice or care about another potential hallway confrontation. A few slowed their pace, sensing the possibility of entertainment, but none showed any inclination to intervene. This was how it always worked in high school, the social contract that demanded everyone mind their own business, even when someone was clearly in trouble. Ethan met Blake's gaze steadily, keeping his voice calm and neutral. "I'm just trying to get to class. I don't want any trouble." "See, that's your problem right there," Blake said, his voice taking on a mock-concerned tone that was loud enough to carry to the growing audience. "You're always in such a hurry, always so focused on school, school, school. Maybe you need to learn how to relax a little. Maybe you need to understand that there's more to high school than just keeping your head down and hoping nobody notices you." Without warning, Connor grabbed Ethan's backpack and yanked it off his shoulders with enough force to send him stumbling backward. The sudden motion caused the partially open main compartment to spill its contents across the hallway floor. Notebooks, pens, his worn copy of The Outsiders, and the sandwich his mother had packed for lunch in a brown paper bag. The sight of his possessions scattered across the dirty linoleum, being stepped on and kicked aside by passing students, sent a spike of humiliation through his chest that was almost physical in its intensity. "Oops," Connor said with exaggerated innocence, his pale eyes glittering with amusement. "Butterfingers, I'm really sorry about that, man. Here, let me help you out." He made a show of trying to help gather the scattered items, but each movement seemed designed to make the situation worse. Stepping on papers, accidentally kicking pens further down the hall, crushing the sandwich bag under his heel with enough force to send its contents oozing through the brown paper. Ethan looked down at his ruined belongings, then back at the two seniors who were watching him with expressions of barely contained glee. Every instinct Uncle Ray had trained into him screamed for action. Specific techniques flashed through his mind, combinations that could end this confrontation in seconds. A quick jab to Blake's solar plexus to fold him over, followed by a knee to the face. A leg sweep to take Connor down, then a heel stomp to keep him there. He could visualize the entire sequence playing out, could feel his body automatically shifting into the balanced stance that would give him maximum leverage and mobility. But he also heard Ray's voice, as clear as if his uncle were standing right beside him. "The strongest fighter is the one who never has to prove it. Any fool can start a fight, Ethan. It takes real strength to walk away when your ego wants you to stay and fight." So instead of striking, Ethan knelt and began collecting his scattered papers. His movements were deliberate and controlled, each gesture designed to project calm rather than defeat. He could feel dozens of eyes watching him, could hear the whispered commentary of students who had stopped to witness his humiliation. Some were clearly entertained by the spectacle, already composing social media posts about the new kid who couldn't even stand up for himself. Others looked uncomfortable but unwilling to get involved, their faces reflecting the kind of guilty relief that came from knowing they weren't the ones being targeted. "Thanks for the help," Ethan said quietly, his voice devoid of sarcasm or anger. He had learned long ago that feeding a bully's need for reaction only made things worse. Better to deny them the satisfaction and hope they would grow bored and move on to easier targets. Blake's smile faltered slightly, as if Ethan's lack of response had somehow ruined the fun. "What a little pushover," he said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "Come on, Connor, this isn't even entertaining." They walked away, leaving Ethan to gather his scattered homework, while other students stepped around him like he was part of the furniture. The hallway gradually returned to its normal rhythm, the brief drama already forgotten, As everyone moved on to more pressing concerns, like upcoming tests and weekend plans, only one person stopped to help, a girl named Maya Chen from his chemistry class, who knelt beside him and began collecting some of the loose sheets that had drifted furthest from the main pile. She was small and delicate-looking, with straight black hair that fell to her shoulders and serious dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Ethan had noticed her before because she was one of the few students who seemed as committed to academic achievement as he was, always prepared for class and willing to ask thoughtful questions. "They're complete jerks," she said quietly, handing him a crumpled worksheet. "But they usually get bored if you don't give them the reaction they're looking for. Most people learn to just avoid them." Ethan nodded his thanks, but privately doubted it would be that simple. In his experience, bullies rarely got bored, they just got more creative. And something in Blake's eyes had suggested this was far from over. If anything, Ethan's refusal to react had probably only made him a more interesting target, a puzzle that needed to be solved rather than dismissed. "I'm Maya, by the case you hadn't figured that out," she said as they stood up together. "Chemistry class, second period. You sit 3 seats behind me." "Ethan," he replied, surprised that she had noticed him at all. "And yeah, I know. You always ask the questions I'm thinking, but don't have the courage to ask out loud." She smiled at that, a genuine expression that briefly transformed her serious face. "Well, if you ever want a lab partner who actually knows what she's doing, let me know. Most of the people in that class are just trying to figure out how to make something explode." As they walked toward their respective classes, Ethan found himself thinking that maybe Roosevelt High wasn't entirely populated by predators and their prey. Maybe there were still a few people worth knowing, even if they were harder to find than the bullies who made themselves so visible. But as the day progressed, he couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with Blake and Connor was just the beginning. He had seen that particular gleam in their eyes before, and he knew it meant they weren't done with him. Not by a long shot. Chapter 2. Escalation. Over the next week, Blake Harrison and Connor Mills proved Ethan's instincts disturbingly correct. The harassment escalated systematically, as if they were following some unwritten playbook designed to gradually break down their target's resistance while maintaining plausible deniability. What had started as occasional accidents and casual bumps evolved into a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare that seemed designed to make Ethan's life as miserable as possible, while keeping their activities just below the threshold that would attract administrative attention. It began with verbal harassment during passing periods. Blake and Connor would position themselves strategically along Ethan's most common routes between classes, always with a small audience of followers who would laugh appreciatively at whatever cruelty they had devised for that day. The comments were never quite explicit enough to be classified as threats, but their intent was unmistakable. "Hey, new boy," Blake would call out as Ethan tried to navigate past them. "Still working on that invisible man routine? Because I hate to break it to you, but it's not working. We can still see you." "Maybe he thinks if he keeps his head down long enough, we'll forget he exists," Connor would add, his voice carrying just the right note of mock sympathy. "That's kind of sad, actually. Imagine being so forgettable that you think people might just overlook you completely." Their followers, a rotating cast of hangers-on who seemed to exist solely to validate Blake's sense of power, would dutifully laugh at these observations, creating a chorus of derision that followed Ethan down the hallway like a cloud of toxic gas. The psychological impact was considerable, not just because of the words themselves, but because of how public they made his humiliation. Everyone could see that he was being targeted, and everyone could see that he wasn't fighting back. In the brutal arithmetic of high school social dynamics, that made him weak, and weakness was contagious. The physical harassment became more aggressive and systematic as well. What had once been occasional shoulder checks evolved into deliberate body slams that sent Ethan crashing into lockers hard enough to leave bruises on his ribs and shoulders. Blake seemed to take particular pleasure in these attacks, timing them perfectly to occur when teachers were distracted or looking the other way. He had clearly studied the blind spots in the school's surveillance system and knew exactly where he could get away with more aggressive behavior. But it was Connor who proved to be the more creative tormentor. While Blake relied mainly on brute force and intimidation, Connor specialized in psychological manipulation, the kind of subtle cruelty that was almost impossible to report because it looked like harmless pranks to casual observers. He would wait until Ethan was focused on something else, then deliberately knock his books out of his hands while apologizing profusely for his clumsiness. He would bump into Ethan just as he was taking a drink from a water fountain, causing him to choke and spill water down his shirt. He would step on the back of Ethan's shoes while they were walking, causing him to stumble and drawing snickers from nearby students. The most frustrating part was how completely the adults in the building seemed oblivious to what was happening. Teachers either genuinely didn't notice the harassment or had developed the kind of willful blindness that allowed them to focus on curriculum delivery while ignoring the complex social dynamics playing out in their classrooms. When Ethan's English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, asked why he seemed distracted during discussions of Romeo and Juliet, he couldn't exactly explain that Blake Harrison had spent the previous 5 minutes flicking paper balls at the back of his head, while maintaining perfect eye contact with the teacher whenever she glanced in their direction. The administration was even worse. Principal Davidson, a well-meaning but overwhelmed woman in her late 50s, had clearly decided that the best way to handle the school's discipline problems was to focus exclusively on obvious infractions, fights, drug possession, truancy, while leaving the subtler forms of harassment to work themselves out naturally. Her philosophy seemed to be that kids will be kids, and that a certain amount of social friction was just part of the high school experience. Ethan had considered reporting the harassment multiple times, but each incident individually seemed too minor to warrant official intervention. How do you explain to an adult that someone is systematically destroying your mental health through a series of actions that could all be dismissed as accidents or misunderstandings? How do you prove intentional cruelty when the perpetrators are careful to maintain plausible deniability for everything they do? The isolation was almost as damaging as the harassment itself. Ethan's fellow students, recognizing that he had been marked as a target, began to instinctively avoid him. It wasn't necessarily conscious cruelty on their part, more like a survival instinct that warned them against associating with someone who was clearly at the bottom of the social food chain. In the cruel mathematics of teenage social life, being seen as his friend could easily make them targets as well, and most people weren't willing to take that risk for someone they barely knew. Maya Chen was one of the few exceptions. She continued to treat him normally in chemistry class, partnering with him for lab assignments and occasionally asking about his weekend plans or his thoughts on their latest reading assignment in English. But even she seemed to understand the unspoken rules that governed their interactions. She was friendly during class time, when they were already sitting near each other anyway, but she didn't go out of her way to be seen talking to him in the hallways or cafeteria. It was during lunch that the harassment reached its most creative and humiliating peaks. The cafeteria at Roosevelt High was a massive space filled with long tables arranged in rough sections that corresponded to the school's various social tribes. The athletes claimed the tables nearest the windows, the theater kids gathered near the stage area, the honor students clustered around the tables closest to the library entrance, and various other cliques carved out their own territories based on shared interests or social status. Ethan had taken to eating alone at a small table in the far corner, as far from the main traffic flow as possible. He would arrive early, claim his spot, and methodically work through his lunch while reviewing notes for afternoon classes. It was a routine designed to minimize social interaction and avoid drawing unwanted attention. But Blake and Connor had apparently decided that his desire for privacy was precisely what made him such an appealing target. Their campaign against him reached a memorable crescendo on a Thursday afternoon in early October. Ethan had been particularly looking forward to lunch that day because his mother had packed one of his favorite meals, a turkey and Swiss sandwich on the sourdough bread she made fresh every Sunday, along with an apple and a small bag of the homemade cookies that always reminded him of better times back in California. It was a small comfort in an otherwise miserable day, and he had been thinking about it through his morning classes. He had chosen his usual corner table and was just unwrapping the sandwich when he noticed Blake and Connor approaching with theatrical stealth. Blake was carrying a full cup of chocolate milk, the thick, artificially sweetened kind that the cafeteria served in small cartons, while Connor followed slightly behind, both of them wearing expressions of exaggerated innocence that immediately put Ethan on high alert. "Hey there, Ethan," Blake said loudly enough to draw attention from nearby tables. Several students looked up from their own meals, sensing the possibility of entertainment. "I heard you were really thirsty over here." Before Ethan could react or even fully process what was happening, Blake accidentally tripped over his own feet, sending the entire contents of the cup cascading over Ethan's head and down his shirt. The cold liquid soaked through his clothes instantly, turning his white t-shirt brown and creating a sticky, chocolatey mess that dripped onto his homework and created a spreading puddle on the table. The smell was overwhelming, sweet and artificial and somehow nauseating when experienced in such quantity. The cafeteria erupted in laughter. Students at nearby tables immediately pulled out their phones to capture the moment, already composing social media posts about the milk shower kid. The sound of their amusement echoed off the walls, creating a wall of noise that seemed to press against Ethan from all directions. He sat perfectly still for several seconds, chocolate milk dripping from his hair and eyelashes, feeling dozens of eyes fixed on him with a mixture of entertainment and pity. "Oh my God, I'm so clumsy," Blake said with mock concern, his voice loud enough to carry to the entire cafeteria. "I am so sorry about that. Here, let me help you clean up." He grabbed a handful of napkins from a nearby dispenser and began roughly scrubbing at Ethan's head, pressing hard enough to be painful while maintaining the pretense of helpfulness. The paper napkins immediately became soggy and useless, simply smearing the chocolate milk around rather than absorbing it. "There we go," Blake said, scrubbing harder. "Good as new." Connor joined in their assistance, grabbing more napkins and attacking Ethan's shirt with the kind of aggressive wiping that was clearly designed to humiliate rather than help. They worked together with practiced efficiency, their movements becoming increasingly rough until they were essentially smacking Ethan with wet napkins while maintaining expressions of helpful concern. "Try to be more careful next time," Blake announced when they finished their performance, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe sit somewhere less dangerous." "Yeah," Connor added, surveying their handiwork with satisfaction. "Wouldn't want you to get hurt or anything." They walked away to a chorus of laughter and congratulations from their friends, leaving Ethan sitting alone in his corner, covered in chocolate milk and surrounded by the wreckage of his lunch. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the humiliation. It was watching how quickly everyone else returned to their conversations, how easily they dismissed what had just happened. A few students shot him sympathetic glances, but none offered help. The unspoken message was clear. This was his problem to solve. Ethan remained seated for several long minutes, chocolate milk dripping from his clothes onto the cafeteria floor, trying to process what had just happened and figure out how to respond. His hands were shaking slightly, though whether from rage or humiliation, he couldn't tell. The lunch his mother had lovingly prepared was ruined, soaked through with artificial chocolate and completely inedible. His homework for afternoon classes was similarly destroyed, the ink running together in brown-stained smears that made the text illegible. But more than that, Something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the situation. This wasn't just casual bullying anymore. This was a deliberate campaign designed to break him down systematically. Blake and Connor weren't going to get bored and move on to other targets. They had decided that he was their primary source of entertainment, and they were going to keep escalating until they got the reaction they wanted, or until they completely destroyed his ability to function in this environment. As he finally stood up and began the humiliating walk to the bathroom to clean himself up, Ethan found himself thinking about Uncle Ray's lessons in a new way. All those hours spent learning how to read an opponent's intentions, how to control his breathing under pressure, how to turn aggression into opportunity. Maybe it was time to consider whether pure avoidance was really the wisest strategy. The bathroom was mercifully empty when he arrived, allowing him to assess the damage in relative privacy. His reflection in the mirror was even worse than he had imagined. The chocolate milk had turned his dark hair into a sticky, matted mess, and his white shirt was completely ruined. Brown stains covered his face and neck, and the sweet smell of artificial chocolate seemed to cling to everything. He looked like a child who had suffered some kind of humiliating accident, and he felt even worse. He spent the rest of lunch period trying to clean himself up with paper towels and hand soap, but the damage was too extensive to repair completely. When he finally emerged from the bathroom, still damp and smelling faintly of chocolate, the bell was ringing for fifth period. He would have to spend the rest of the day in ruined clothes, carrying the visible evidence of his humiliation for everyone to see. Walking to his next class, Ethan passed groups of students who were still talking and laughing about what they had witnessed in the cafeteria. Some pointed at him as he went by, not even trying to be subtle about their amusement. Others pretended not to notice him, but he could see them exchanging glances and suppressing smiles. The story of the milk shower kid was already spreading through the school's social networks, becoming part of the shared mythology that would follow him for the rest of his time at Roosevelt High. That afternoon, sitting in his bedroom still wearing the stained clothes because he couldn't bring himself to explain to his mother what had happened, Ethan stared at his reflection in the window and tried to figure out what to do next. The sun was setting earlier now as autumn deepened, casting long shadows across the unfamiliar landscape of his new neighborhood. In a few hours, his parents would come home from work, expecting to hear about his day, and he would have to find some way to explain why his shirt was ruined and why he looked like he had been crying. But more immediately, he needed to decide how to handle tomorrow and the day after that, and all the days that would follow until Blake Harrison and Connor Mills either grew bored with their game or found a new target to torment. The rational part of his mind knew that the smart thing to do was report the incident to Principal Davidson and hope that administrative intervention could solve the problem. But another part of him, the part that had been shaped by 8 years of training under Uncle Ray's guidance, was beginning to wonder if it might be time for a different approach. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found his uncle's number. Ray always answered his calls. No matter what time of day or night, Ethan reached out. It was one of the constants in his life, one of the things he could always count on, even when everything else seemed to be falling apart. The phone rang twice before Ray's familiar voice came through the speaker. "Hey, kiddo, how's the new school treating you?" Ethan closed his eyes and tried to figure out where to begin. Chapter 3. The Call Home. "I think I might need to switch schools," Ethan said without preamble, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undertone that immediately put Ray Cross on high alert. After 8 years of training together, Ray had learned to read his nephew's moods with the same precision that he analyzed potential opponents in the ring. Ethan was scared, frustrated, and trying very hard to sound more composed than he actually felt. "What's going on, kid?" Ray's voice came through clearly despite the 1,000 miles of distance between Oregon and California. Ray was sitting in his office at Warriors Path MMA, the gym still echoing with the sounds of the evening training session that had just concluded. The familiar smell of sweat and rubber mats surrounded him, along with the quiet intensity that always lingered after serious fighters had pushed themselves to their limits. It was an environment where problems were solved with direct action and honest communication, qualities that seemed increasingly rare in the outside world. Ethan took a deep breath and began describing the situation, careful to keep his tone neutral and factual. He told Ray about Blake Harrison and Connor Mills, about the systematic escalation of harassment, about the milk incident in the cafeteria and the way other students had reacted. He explained his attempts to avoid confrontation, his hope that the bullies would grow bored and move on, and his growing realization that the situation was only getting worse. Ray listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never rushing to judgment. It was the same approach he used when students came to him with problems outside the gym. Listen first, understand the full scope of the situation, then offer guidance based on experience rather than emotion. "So why haven't you handled it?" Ray asked when Ethan finished his account. His voice was gentle but direct, carrying the kind of challenge that came from genuine care rather than criticism. "Because you taught me better than that," Ethan replied immediately. "Because fighting doesn't solve anything. Because—" He paused, struggling to find the right words for feelings he hadn't fully acknowledged to himself. "Because you're scared," Ray said quietly, and the words hit like a physical blow. "I'm not scared of them," Ethan said quickly, defensive anger flaring in his voice. "No," Ray agreed. "You're not scared of them. You're scared of yourself. Scared of what you might do if you let go. I get it, Ethan. I really do. But there's a difference between choosing not to fight and being afraid to stand up for yourself." The silence stretched between them for several seconds, filled with the weight of 8 years of shared training and the unspoken understanding that had developed between teacher and student. Ray had been more than just a martial arts instructor to Ethan. He had been a mentor, a father figure during the difficult years when Ethan's own father was working long hours to support the family, and the one person who truly understood the complexity of learning to control something as dangerous as fighting skill. "So what am I supposed to do?" Ethan finally asked, and Ray could hear the exhaustion in his voice. This wasn't just physical tiredness. This was the bone-deep weariness that came from carrying stress and fear for weeks without relief. "You're supposed to remember why I taught you to fight in the first place," Ray said, his voice taking on the instructional tone that Ethan had heard thousands of times during training sessions. "Not to hurt people, but to protect yourself and others when no other option exists. Sometimes, kiddo, the only way to stop a bully is to show them that there are consequences for their actions. Sometimes the only language they understand is the threat of physical consequences." "But if I fight them," Ethan began. "Then you fight them," Ray interrupted, "but you do it smart, you do it controlled, and you make sure they understand that you're not someone they want to mess with anymore. Can you do that?" Ethan thought about Blake's mocking laughter and Connor's cruel smile. He thought about the sea of indifferent faces in the cafeteria, the way his classmates had watched his humiliation with entertainment rather than sympathy. He thought about tomorrow and the day after that, and all the days that would follow if nothing changed. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I can." "Good," Ray said, and Ethan could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "But remember everything I taught you about control. This isn't about revenge or proving how tough you are. This is about establishing boundaries and making it clear that certain behavior has consequences. You understand the difference?" "I understand." "And Ethan, when this is over, and it will be over, you call me and tell me exactly what happened, not because I don't trust you, but because I want to make sure you're handling it the right way. Deal?" "Deal." After hanging up, Ethan sat in his bedroom as darkness settled over the neighborhood, thinking about the conversation and what it meant for tomorrow. The chocolate milk smell still clung to his clothes, despite his attempts to wash it out, serving as a constant reminder of his humiliation and the choice he now faced. He could continue trying to avoid confrontation, hoping that eventually Blake and Connor would grow bored and move on to other targets. Or he could take Ray's advice and show them that their actions had consequences. The decision, when it finally crystallized, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. He had tried the passive approach for weeks, and it had only made things worse. His attempts to avoid conflict had been interpreted as weakness, and weakness was like blood in the water to predators like Blake and Connor. If he wanted the harassment to stop, he was going to have to make it stop. But that didn't mean he had to become the aggressor or lose control of the situation. Ray had taught him that real fighting was about discipline as much as technique, about knowing when to strike and when to hold back. If he handled this correctly, he could end the harassment without becoming the kind of person he didn't want to be. That night, for the first time in weeks, Ethan slept soundly. The decision had been made, and tomorrow he would find out whether 8 years of training under Uncle Ray's guidance had prepared him for something more than just tournament competition. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. The next morning brought a new level of harassment, as if Blake Harrison and Connor Mills had somehow sensed that their psychological campaign was reaching a crucial inflection point. They seemed determined to push Ethan past his breaking point, escalating their tactics with the kind of calculated cruelty that suggested they viewed his destruction as a personal challenge rather than mere entertainment. It started during first period biology with Mr. Thompson, a soft-spoken man in his early 60s who had clearly lost most of his enthusiasm for teaching somewhere around his 20th year in the classroom. Thompson taught from behind his desk, rarely moving around the room to observe student behavior, which made his class a perfect hunting ground for subtle forms of harassment that flew under administrative radar. Connor Mills had positioned himself in the seat directly behind Ethan, despite the fact that assigned seating should have placed him 3 rows away. Mr. Thompson either hadn't noticed the switch or had decided it wasn't worth the effort to correct, leaving Ethan trapped with no easy way to escape what was coming. The harassment began almost immediately after the bell rang. Connor started by accidentally knocking Ethan's textbook off his desk every few minutes throughout the entire class period. Each time, he would offer exaggerated apologies and helpful suggestions about keeping his materials more secure, speaking just loudly enough to draw brief glances from nearby students, but quietly enough to avoid attracting the teacher's attention. "Oops, sorry about that," Connor would whisper each time the book hit the floor with a loud thud. "You really need to be more careful with your stuff." After the 5th or 6th repetition, Mr. Thompson glanced up from his lesson plan with mild irritation. "Is there a problem back there?" "No, sir," Connor replied with perfect innocence. "Just trying to help Ethan keep his book on his desk. It keeps falling for some reason." A few students snickered at the obvious lie, but Mr. Thompson simply returned to his lecture about cellular respiration without investigating further. The message was clear. As long as the disruption remained relatively minor, Ethan was on his own. During second period chemistry, Maya Chen's class, Blake Harrison took a different approach. He positioned himself directly behind Ethan and spent the entire 50 minutes flicking small pieces of paper at the back of his head. Each tiny projectile was precisely aimed and timed to coincide with moments when Mrs. Rodriguez was focused on the whiteboard or helping other students. The impacts were small, barely noticeable individually, but the cumulative effect was maddening. Ethan could feel each piece of paper as it struck his hair or the back of his neck, could sense Blake's amusement radiating from the seat behind him like heat from a fire. Maya, sitting 2 seats to his left, occasionally glanced over with expressions of sympathy and growing anger, but she was smart enough to understand that any intervention on her part would only make things worse for both of them. The paper balls continued throughout the entire class period, a steady rhythm of tiny humiliations that made it impossible for Ethan to focus on the lesson about chemical bonding. By the time the bell rang, he had counted at least 30 individual strikes, each one a small reminder that he was completely powerless to stop what was happening to him. But it was during lunch that Blake and Connor truly revealed the extent of their creativity and cruelty. Ethan had barely sat down at his usual corner table when they appeared, flanked by their regular entourage of followers. Today's group included Ryan Brooks, a stocky football player whose intelligence seemed inversely proportional to his muscle mass, Josh Parker, a junior who existed solely to laugh at Blake's jokes and validate his sense of superiority, and Nathan Cross, whose shared last name with Ethan had become a source of particular amusement for the group. Family reunion time. Blake announced loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear, gesturing dramatically between Ethan and Nathan. "Look, everyone, we found your long-lost cousin. Maybe he can teach you how to actually stand up for yourself." "Nah," Connor chimed in, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "I don't think it's genetic. Some people are just born to be losers." The surrounding tables began to quiet as students sensed the building tension. This felt different from their previous encounters. More public, more aggressive, more designed for maximum humiliation. Ethan continued eating his sandwich methodically, but his awareness expanded to include every person in his immediate vicinity, every possible avenue of movement, every potential weapon within reach. Ray's training had taught him to assess threats automatically, and what he saw wasn't encouraging. 5 against 1, with Blake and Connor being the real physical threats, and the others serving mainly as psychological pressure and potential backup. The cafeteria layout offered limited escape routes, and the growing audience meant any confrontation would be extremely public. Every instinct told him to find a way to de-escalate or withdraw, but Blake's next words made it clear that those options were no longer available. "You know what I think?" Blake continued, his voice getting louder to ensure maximum audience participation. "I think our boy Ethan here is all talk and no action. I think he's been pretending to be tough, but deep down, he's just another scared little kid who runs home to mommy when things get rough." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. Ethan thought about his mother, probably at home right now trying to make their new house feel like a home, unaware that her son was being systematically destroyed by classmates she had never met. He thought about his father, working long hours at a job he didn't particularly enjoy to support their family's fresh start. He thought about his sister Sophia, who had adapted to their move with the resilience that seemed to come naturally to 12-year-olds, and who looked up to him as the big brother who was supposed to have everything figured out. The sandwich in his hands suddenly tasted like cardboard. Ethan set it down carefully and looked up, meeting Blake's eyes directly for the first time since the harassment had begun. "I think you should find someone else to bother," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the increasingly silent cafeteria. Blake's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Oh, look at that! It speaks! And what exactly are you going to do if we don't? Call the principal? File a complaint? Face it, Ethan, you're not going to do anything because you can't do anything. You're weak." Connor leaned in closer, his pale green eyes glittering with malicious anticipation. "Come on, tough guy. Prove us wrong. Show everyone what you've got." Ethan felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with genuine threat assessment, the hyper-awareness that Ray had trained into him during thousands of hours of sparring. His uncle's voice echoed in his memory. When someone pushes you past the point of reasonable tolerance, when they won't stop no matter how much you try to avoid conflict, that's when you make a choice. You can keep taking it, or you can end it. The decision crystallized in that moment, not born of anger or revenge, but of simple necessity. This wasn't going to stop on its own. Administrative intervention was clearly not coming. His attempts to avoid confrontation had only made him a more appealing target. Sometimes Ray had taught him the only way to deal with a bully was to show them that their actions had consequences. "Outside," Ethan said quietly, standing up from the table. "The courtyard, right now." The cafeteria exploded into excited chatter as students realized what was happening. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The quiet new kid finally pushed past his breaking point, about to face off against two of the school's most notorious bullies. Phones appeared immediately, students positioning themselves for the best views and preparing to capture whatever was about to unfold. Blake's followers wore expressions of anticipatory glee, certain they were about to witness their leader demolish the quiet kid who had finally been pushed too far. Blake himself looked momentarily surprised by Ethan's directness, but his familiar sneer quickly returned. "Finally," he said, loud enough for the entire cafeteria to hear. "I was starting to think you were going to disappoint me forever." As the crowd began moving toward the exits that led to the central courtyard, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm settling over him. This was it. The moment when months of harassment would finally be answered. He had tried every other option, had exhausted every alternative approach. Now it was time to find out whether 8 years of training under Uncle Ray's guidance had prepared him for something more than tournament competition. The decision was made. There was no going back now. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The central courtyard at Roosevelt High School was a large rectangular space surrounded by classroom windows on all 4 sides, with concrete walkways forming a cross pattern through the center and patches of grass filling the corners. During normal lunch periods, it hosted scattered groups of students eating outside, catching up on homework, or simply enjoying whatever sunshine managed to break through Oregon's perpetual cloud cover. Today, word of the impending confrontation had spread through the building like wildfire, and dozens of teenagers were emerging from the cafeteria and nearby classrooms to form an impromptu arena. The excitement was palpable. This was the kind of raw drama that broke up the monotony of academic routine and provided material for social media posts and hallway conversations for weeks to come. Ethan positioned himself in the center of the space, his stance appearing casual but perfectly balanced. 8 years of training with Uncle Ray had taught him to look relaxed while maintaining complete readiness, feet shoulder-width apart, weight evenly distributed, hands loose at his sides. To most observers, he probably looked nervous or uncertain. In reality, he was conducting the same threat assessment that had become second nature during countless sparring sessions. Blake Harrison and Connor Mills approached from opposite directions, clearly intending to flank him. Their followers spread out in a rough semicircle, blocking potential escape routes while ensuring they had clear views of the action. The crowd of onlookers pressed closer, phones already recording, their faces reflecting the kind of bloodthirsty anticipation that seemed to be hardwired into teenage social dynamics. Ethan could see faces in the classroom windows above, teachers and students alike drawn by the commotion in the courtyard. In the distance, he spotted Principal Davidson pushing through the crowd, but she was still too far away to intervene quickly. Whatever was going to happen would be over long before any adult authority could stop it. "Last chance to back down," Blake called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation, someone whose size and reputation had always been enough to intimidate potential opponents into submission. "Just get on your knees, apologize for wasting our time, and maybe we'll go easy on you." The crowd pressed closer, sensing that the moment of truth had arrived. Ethan could feel their collective anticipation like electricity in the air, could see the mixture of excitement and fear on their faces as they waited to witness violence unfold. Some were clearly rooting for Blake and Connor, eager to see the quiet new kid get what they perceived as his inevitable comeuppance. Others looked uncomfortable but unable to look away, caught between moral objection and morbid curiosity. "Your move," Ethan said simply, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard despite its quiet tone. Blake exchanged a quick glance with Connor, and they attacked simultaneously. It was exactly what Ethan had expected, a crude pincer movement designed to overwhelm him with numbers rather than skill. Blake came straight forward with a wild haymaker punch, while Connor circled right to attack from the side, their coordination suggesting they had used this tactic successfully before. But Uncle Ray had spent countless hours preparing Ethan for exactly this situation. Most people who think they can fight have never actually learned how to fight, Ray had explained during one of their training sessions. They rely on size, aggression, and intimidation because those things work against other untrained people. But real fighting is about timing, distance, and using your opponent's own force against them. As Blake's punch came forward, Ethan stepped forward and slightly left, moving inside the arc of the strike while simultaneously grabbing the extended arm. Using Blake's own momentum, he pivoted smoothly and threw him directly into Connor's path. The two bullies collided in a tangle of arms and legs, stumbling backward as Ethan flowed smoothly out of range. The crowd erupted in surprised shouts. This wasn't what anyone had expected. Blake Harrison had never been thrown before, had never been made to look clumsy or weak in front of an audience. The sight of him tangled up with Connor, both of them struggling to regain their balance, sent a ripple of shock through the assembled students. Blake recovered first, his face flushed with embarrassment and fury. 8 years of being the undisputed king of his social circle had not prepared him for the humiliation of being handled so easily by someone he had dismissed as weak and helpless. "Lucky shot," he snarled, charging forward again with Connor close behind. The wild anger in his eyes suggested that any pretense of controlled aggression had been abandoned. This was now about revenge and the desperate need to reassert his dominance in front of his followers. This time, Ethan didn't retreat. As Blake closed the distance, Ethan dropped into a low stance and drove his shoulder into Blake's midsection, lifting him off his feet and slamming him onto the concrete with a wrestling takedown that would have impressed his high school's coaching staff. The impact drove the air from Blake's lungs and left him gasping on the ground, his expensive clothes now torn and dirty. Before Connor could react, Ethan rolled smoothly to his feet and caught him with a perfectly timed uppercut that snapped his head back and sent him stumbling. The punch was controlled, designed to stun rather than cause serious injury, but its precision and power were unmistakable. "Stay down," Ethan advised, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel that made several students in the crowd take involuntary steps backward. But Blake was already struggling to his feet, rage overriding any rational assessment of the situation. His carefully maintained image as the school's alpha predator was being destroyed in front of dozens of witnesses, and his desperation to restore that image was making him increasingly dangerous. "You little freak," Blake gasped, pulling a metal water bottle from his backpack. The stainless steel container was heavy and solid, easily capable of cracking a skull if used with sufficient force. "I'm going to cave your head in." The improvised weapon changed the dynamic completely. Ethan couldn't afford to play defensive anymore. An armed opponent required immediate neutralization. The crowd gasped as they realized the fight had escalated beyond anything they had expected. This wasn't typical teenage posturing anymore. This was genuinely dangerous. As Blake swung the water bottle in a wide arc toward his head, Ethan stepped inside the attack and trapped the arm against his body. His left hand shot up in a short, sharp strike to Blake's solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs and causing him to double over in agony. The water bottle clattered to the concrete as Blake's grip went slack. Without pausing, Ethan spun Blake around and applied a blood choke. Not the dangerous trachea-crushing hold that inexperienced fighters often attempted, but the precise application of pressure to the carotid arteries that cut off blood flow to the brain. Ray had drilled this technique into him thousands of times, emphasizing the importance of control and timing. "Go to sleep," Ethan whispered, maintaining the hold until Blake's struggles ceased and he collapsed unconscious. The technique was non-lethal but highly effective. Blake would wake up in a few minutes with nothing more than a headache and a severely damaged reputation. Connor, seeing his leader defeated and unconscious, tried to flee. But Ethan caught him with a spinning heel kick to the midsection that folded him in half, followed by a controlled knee strike to the head that put him on the ground beside his friend. Connor remained conscious but completely incapacitated, curled up in a fetal position and making small, whimpering sounds. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 2 minutes. Ethan stood over his defeated opponents, breathing hard but otherwise unharmed, while the courtyard fell completely silent except for Connor's groaning and the distant sound of Principal Davidson shouting for people to clear the way. Blake's followers, Ryan Brooks, Josh Parker and Nathan Cross, stood frozen in shock, their expressions cycling through disbelief, fear, and something that might have been grudging respect. The wider crowd of spectators began to murmur among themselves, sharing instant replays and commentary on what they had just witnessed. Phones continued recording, capturing every detail for immediate upload to social media platforms. "Anyone else?" Ethan asked, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. His tone was calm, but unmistakably dangerous, carrying the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what he was capable of. No one moved. The 3 remaining members of Blake's crew seemed to shrink into themselves, suddenly understanding that their association with the school's former alpha predator might not be the social advantage they had previously considered it. Principal Davidson finally reached the center of the commotion, her face grim as she surveyed the scene. Blake was just beginning to stir, slowly regaining consciousness with a confused expression that suggested he wasn't entirely sure what had happened to him. Connor remained on the ground, conscious but clearly in no condition to continue fighting. "Everyone back to the building now!" Principal Davidson shouted, her voice carrying the kind of authority that sent students scattering in all directions. Then she turned to Ethan, her expression unreadable. "My office, immediately." Ethan nodded, stepping carefully over Blake's still prone form as he walked toward the building. Behind him, he could hear the crowd's excited chatter resuming as students processed what they had witnessed. By the end of the school day, everyone at Roosevelt High would know exactly what had happened in the courtyard. The quiet new kid had just rewritten the social hierarchy in the most dramatic way possible. As he walked through the hallways toward the principal's office, Ethan felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but he knew that consequences were coming. The question was whether those consequences would be worse than continuing to endure systematic harassment and humiliation. One way or another, everything was about to change. Chapter 6: Consequences and Revelations. Principal Davidson's office was a study in bureaucratic functionality, with beige walls lined with educational posters about anti-bullying initiatives and college preparation. Her desk was cluttered with paperwork, coffee-stained reports, and the accumulated detritus of someone trying to manage the complex social ecosystem of a large high school with insufficient resources and support. She gestured for Ethan to sit in one of the 2 chairs facing her desk while she reviewed the incident reports that had already begun arriving from teachers who had witnessed the courtyard confrontation. "Well, Mr. Cross," she said after several minutes of silence, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had dealt with similar situations countless times before. "This is certainly not how I expected to spend my afternoon. Would you like to explain to me what happened out there?" Ethan chose his words carefully, understanding that his response could determine whether he faced suspension, expulsion, or something in between. "Blake Harrison and Connor Mills have been harassing me for weeks. Today they escalated to threats and attempted assault with a weapon. I defended myself." Principal Davidson raised an eyebrow at his clinical description of events. "Defended yourself? Mr. Cross, You put 2 students in the nurse's office. One of them was unconscious for several minutes. That seems like rather excessive self-defense for a simple disagreement between teenagers. Blake Harrison threatened to cave my head in and attacked me with a metal water bottle, Ethan replied evenly. Connor Mills has been systematically harassing me since my first week here. I used the minimum force necessary to end the threat. As if summoned by their conversation, a sharp knock on the office door interrupted them. Vice Principal Thompson entered without waiting for permission, followed by Blake Harrison and Connor Mills, both looking considerably worse for wear than they had that morning. Blake sported a magnificent bruise on his jaw and moved with the careful stiffness of someone whose ribs were extremely sore. Connor had the beginnings of what would undoubtedly become a spectacular black eye and was holding his midsection tenderly. "Sit down," Principal Davidson instructed, gesturing to the remaining chairs and the small couch against the far wall. "I want to hear everyone's version of what happened before I make any decisions about consequences." Blake immediately launched into an account that bore only passing resemblance to reality. According to his version, he and Connor had simply been trying to be friendly with the new student when Ethan had suddenly attacked them without provocation. He painted himself as the victim of an unprovoked assault by someone who was clearly unstable and dangerous. "We were just trying to include him, you know," Blake said, his voice taking on the wounded tone of someone who had been unjustly persecuted. "He's been really antisocial since he got here, and we thought maybe he was just shy. So we went over to talk to him at lunch, and he just went crazy. Started screaming about how he was going to hurt us, and then he attacked Connor for no reason." Connor nodded vigorously, despite the obvious pain the movement caused him. It was terrifying. He was like a different person. His eyes went all weird, and he started talking about how he was trained to kill people. We tried to get away, but he chased us outside and beat us up in front of everyone. Principal Davidson turned to Ethan with an expression that suggested she had heard similar stories many times before. The difficulty of sorting truth from fiction in teenage disputes was one of the most challenging aspects of her job, particularly when the incidents occurred without clear adult supervision. "Well, Mr. Cross, how do you respond to these accusations?" Ethan had expected this exact scenario. Bullies were always skilled at rewriting history when consequences loomed, transforming themselves from aggressors into victims with the kind of creative storytelling that would have impressed fiction writers. But he had also noticed something that Blake and Connor had apparently missed in their rush to portray themselves as innocent victims. "I'd like to request that you review the security footage from the cafeteria and courtyard," Ethan said calmly. "I believe it will provide a more accurate account of what actually happened." The effect on Blake and Connor was immediate and dramatic. Blake's face went pale, and Connor actually winced, as if he had been physically struck. Clearly, in their focus on creating a compelling narrative, they had forgotten about the school's extensive surveillance system. Principal Davidson's eyebrows rose slightly. It was unusual for students to request security footage review. Most teenagers tried to avoid any form of documentation that might contradict their preferred version of events. "That's an interesting suggestion, Mr. Cross. Are you confident that the footage will support your account of these events?" "Completely confident," Ethan replied. "I believe it will show approximately 3 weeks of systematic harassment by Mr. Harrison and Mr. Mills, culminating in today's incident where Mr. Harrison threatened me with a weapon and I defended myself using appropriate force." The silence in the office was profound. Blake and Connor exchanged increasingly desperate glances, clearly trying to figure out how to modify their story to account for potential video evidence. But the damage was already done. Their initial lie had been exposed, and any subsequent modifications would only make them look worse. "Very well," Principal Davidson said, reaching for her phone. "Mr. Thompson, please contact our security office and request footage from the cafeteria and courtyard for today's lunch period." Also, I want a review of any incidents involving these 3 students over the past month. While they waited for the security review, Principal Davidson conducted separate interviews with each student. Blake and Connor's stories became increasingly inconsistent as they tried to account for evidence they hadn't initially considered. They couldn't explain why the harassment had been ongoing for weeks, couldn't justify Blake's possession of a weapon, and couldn't provide credible explanations for the numerous witnesses who had seen them initiate the confrontation. Ethan's account, by contrast, remained consistent and detailed. He provided specific dates and times for previous incidents, named witnesses who could corroborate his claims, and offered a precise description of the day's events that aligned perfectly with what multiple students had recorded on their phones. When the security footage arrived, it told the story more clearly than any verbal account could have. The cameras had captured everything: Connor's systematic harassment during previous incidents, Blake's aggressive approach in the cafeteria, their coordinated attack in the courtyard, Blake's use of the water bottle as a weapon, and Ethan's controlled defensive response that ended the threat with minimal force. "Well," Principal Davidson said after reviewing the footage, her voice heavy with disappointment, "this certainly paints a different picture than the one you two initially provided. Blake made one last, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Look, maybe we were messing with him a little bit, but that's just normal stuff. Everyone does it. He didn't have to try to kill us." "Mr. Harrison," Principal Davidson said coldly, "what I saw on that footage was not normal stuff. What I saw was systematic harassment escalating to assault with a weapon, and Mr. Cross's response, while certainly effective, was clearly defensive in nature." The final verdicts reflected the clarity of the evidence. Blake and Connor each received 2-week suspensions for harassment, assault, and making false statements to school administration. Blake faced additional consequences for weapon possession, and both students were required to attend counseling sessions addressing bullying behavior. Ethan received a 1-day suspension, the minimum consequence for fighting on school property, reduced from the standard 3 days due to the clearly defensive nature of his actions and the extensive documentation of prior harassment. "Mr. Cross," Principal Davidson said as she concluded the disciplinary meeting, "while I understand that you were defending yourself, I hope you understand that physical violence is never our preferred solution to these kinds of problems. In the future, please come to the administration immediately if you're experiencing harassment." Ethan nodded politely, though privately he wondered how effective administrative intervention would have been against Blake and Connor's carefully calculated campaign of psychological warfare. Sometimes, he reflected, the only language bullies understood was the threat of physical consequences. As he left the principal's office, Ethan felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but he knew that his actions would have far-reaching consequences for his social standing at Roosevelt High. He had just publicly defeated 2 of the school's most notorious bullies in front of dozens of witnesses. That kind of dramatic demonstration of power would inevitably change how his classmates perceived and interacted with him. The question was whether that change would ultimately make his life better or worse. Chapter 7. The New Order. When Ethan returned to Roosevelt High School the following Monday morning, he found himself navigating a completely transformed social landscape. The story of his confrontation with Blake Harrison and Connor Mills had spread through the student body with the speed and intensity of a social media wildfire, growing more dramatic with each retelling. By the time it had circulated through the entire school, various versions depicted him as everything from a secret martial arts prodigy to a dangerously unstable psychopath who had nearly killed 2 students with his bare hands. The reality, as usual, was more nuanced than the mythology. But in the brutal arithmetic of high school social dynamics, perception often mattered more than truth. and the perception of Ethan Cross had fundamentally shifted from harmless weirdo to someone you don't want to mess with. The change was immediately apparent as he walked through the main hallway toward his first period class. Students who had previously looked through him as if he were invisible now nodded respectfully when they passed him. Conversations quieted as he approached, then resumed in hushed tones once he had moved on. Several underclassmen actually stepped aside to give him more room, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and nervous uncertainty. Maya Chen was waiting by his locker when he arrived, her expression cycling through relief, concern, and something that might have been admiration. "Holy shit, Ethan," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Are you okay? I heard Blake and Connor were in the hospital." "They weren't in the hospital," Ethan replied, opening his locker and beginning the familiar routine of organizing his books for the day. Connor had a black eye and Blake was sore, but they were both fine. The rumors tend to get exaggerated pretty quickly around here. "Still," Maya persisted, "what you did was incredible. I've never seen anyone handle those two like that. Where did you learn to fight like that?" It was a question Ethan had been expecting, and one he needed to answer carefully. The truth about his martial arts background wasn't something he wanted to become common knowledge, but Maya had been one of the few people to show him kindness during his difficult first weeks at Roosevelt High. "My uncle runs a martial arts gym back in California," he said, which was technically accurate while omitting the extent of his training. "He taught me some self-defense stuff over the years." Maya studied his face with the same careful attention she brought to their chemistry lab work, clearly sensing there was more to the story, but respecting his desire for privacy. "Well, whatever he taught you, it worked. Blake and Connor have been terrorizing people here since middle school. Nobody's ever stood up to them like that." As they walked toward their first period classes, Maya filled him in on the social aftermath of Friday's confrontation. Blake and Connor's absence from school had created a power vacuum that was already being filled by other students who had previously deferred to their authority. Ryan Brooks, Josh Parker, and Nathan Cross, Blake's former followers, had apparently spent the weekend frantically trying to distance themselves from their former leaders while avoiding any association with the violence that had ended their reign. "The funny thing is," Maya observed as they separated at the junction between the science and English wings, "people are acting like you're some kind of dangerous lunatic, but you're actually one of the nicest guys in our class. It's like they can't figure out how those two things fit together." Ethan reflected on her words as he took his seat in AP English Literature. She had identified something important about the cognitive dissonance his classmates were experiencing. For 3 weeks, he had been the quiet, harmless new kid who got picked on without fighting back. Now, suddenly, he was someone who had defeated 2 notorious bullies with what appeared to be professional-level fighting skills. The gap between those two identities was difficult for teenagers to reconcile, particularly when most of their understanding of violence came from movies and video games rather than real experience. Mrs. Patterson, his English teacher, seemed to be struggling with the same disconnect. She had always treated him as a serious student who contributed thoughtful comments to class discussions about literature. Now she kept shooting him nervous glances, as if she was seeing him for the first time and wasn't entirely sure what she was looking at. The morning passed with relative normalcy, though Ethan could feel the undercurrent of attention and speculation that followed him through each class. Students who had never spoken to him before found excuses to start conversations, their curiosity about his background and capabilities barely concealed behind polite small talk. It was during lunch that the most significant encounter occurred. Ethan had returned to his usual corner table, half expecting to eat alone as he had for the past month. Instead, he found himself approached by a delegation of students he had previously observed from a distance, but never interacted with directly. The group was led by Jessica Martinez, a senior who served as student body president and commanded genuine respect throughout the school. She was tall and athletic, with the kind of natural confidence that came from years of academic and social success. Behind her stood Marcus Kim, the captain of the debate team, Sarah Williams, who edited the school newspaper, and David Chen, Maya's older brother and one of the few students who had managed to maintain his independence from the various social cliques that dominated Roosevelt High's hierarchy. "Mind if we sit?" Jessica asked, though her tone suggested this was more of a statement than a request. Ethan gestured to the empty chairs around his table, curious about what this seemingly random collection of high-achieving students wanted to discuss with him. "We wanted to talk to you about what happened on Friday," Jessica began without preamble, "and more specifically about what it means for the social dynamics of this school." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "Blake Harrison and Connor Mills weren't just bullies, Ethan. They were the center of a whole system of intimidation that affected dozens of students. People who were afraid to speak up in class, afraid to eat lunch in certain areas, afraid to be themselves because they knew it would make them targets." Sarah nodded agreement. "I've been documenting incidents for an article about bullying at Roosevelt High, but I could never get anyone to go on the record because they were all terrified of retaliation. Blake and Connor had created this atmosphere where everyone knew they were untouchable. Until Friday," David added quietly, "when you proved they weren't untouchable at all." Ethan was beginning to understand where this conversation was headed, and he wasn't entirely comfortable with the direction. "I didn't fight them to make a statement about school politics," he said carefully. "I fought them because they wouldn't leave me alone, and I ran out of other options." "We know," Jessica replied. "And that's exactly why what you did was so important. You didn't set out to be a hero or start a revolution. You just refused to be a victim anymore. But whether you intended it or not, your actions have consequences that go way beyond your personal situation." She gestured around the cafeteria, and Ethan followed her gaze to see what she was pointing out. Now that she had drawn his attention to it, he could see the subtle changes in the social dynamics that he had previously missed. Students who typically sat alone or in defensive clusters were now occupying tables in the center of the room. Conversations were louder and more animated. The overall atmosphere seemed lighter, less oppressive. "Look at table 7, Marcus said, indicating a group of sophomore boys who were engaged in what appeared to be an enthusiastic discussion about comic books. "Those kids have been eating lunch in the library for 2 years because Blake's crew used to torment them whenever they tried to eat in here. Today's the first time they've sat in the main cafeteria since their freshman year." Sarah pointed to another table. "And those girls over there, they're from the theater department. Blake and Connor used to make their lives miserable, calling them freaks and weirdos, throwing things at them during rehearsals. They've been asking to eat lunch in the drama room because they were afraid to be seen in public. Today, they're sitting right out in the open." The evidence was undeniable. Ethan's confrontation with Blake and Connor had sent ripples throughout the school's social ecosystem, liberating students who had been living in fear and creating space for people to express themselves more freely. "The thing is," David said, his voice thoughtful, "this kind of change can be fragile. Blake and Connor are suspended for 2 weeks, but they'll be back. And when they return, they're going to be looking for ways to reassert their dominance and get revenge for their humiliation, which is where you come in," Jessica said, looking directly at Ethan. "Whether you like it or not, you've become a symbol of resistance to the bullying culture that's dominated this school for years. People are looking to you for leadership, for protection, for proof that standing up to bullies is possible." Ethan felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the burden of other people's expectations and the responsibility that came with power he had never asked for. "I'm not looking to be anyone's leader or protector," he said quietly. "I just want to be left alone to finish high school and move on with my life." "That's fair," Jessica acknowledged. "And we're not asking you to start patrolling the hallways looking for bullies to fight. But we are asking you to understand that your actions have made you a public figure in this school, and that comes with certain responsibilities." Marcus pulled out a notebook and slid it across the table. "We've been working on some ideas for addressing the bullying problem more systematically. Anonymous reporting systems, peer mediation programs, administrative reforms that would make it harder for harassment to go unnoticed." "The problem is," Sarah added, "none of these programs work if students don't believe they'll be protected from retaliation. For years, kids have been afraid to report bullying because they knew Blake and Connor would make their lives even worse. You've changed that calculation." Ethan looked around the table at their earnest faces, understanding that they were asking him to be something he had never wanted to be. They wanted him to be a symbol, a deterrent, a visible reminder that bullies could face consequences for their actions. It was a role that would require him to maintain the reputation he had earned through violence, even if he never threw another punch. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "But I'm not making any commitments. I didn't come to Roosevelt High to start a revolution." "Sometimes revolutions start themselves," David observed. "And sometimes the people who start them don't get to choose whether they want to be part of them or not." As the group dispersed and lunch period ended, Ethan found himself contemplating the unexpected turn his life had taken. 3 weeks ago, he had been an invisible transfer student trying desperately to avoid attention. Now, he was apparently the focal point of a school-wide social transformation that he had never intended to initiate. The afternoon brought more evidence of his new status. Teachers who had previously ignored him now made point of acknowledging his contributions to class discussions. Students who had never spoken to him before found excuses to start conversations. Several underclassmen actually approached him for advice about dealing with their own bullying situations. But perhaps the most significant encounter came at the end of the day, as Ethan was walking toward the school's main exit. A familiar voice called his name from behind, and he turned to see Blake Harrison approaching alone, moving carefully and obviously still in pain from their Friday confrontation. Blake looked different without Connor at his side and his usual entourage of followers, smaller somehow and definitely less confident. The swagger that had defined his public persona was completely absent, replaced by something that might have been genuine humility. "Ethan," Blake said when he got close enough for private conversation, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Ethan stopped walking but remained alert, unsure whether this was a genuine attempt at communication or some kind of setup for future retaliation. "Look," Blake continued, his voice quiet and lacking any trace of his usual arrogance. "I wanted to apologize for what Connor and I did to you. It wasn't cool, and you had every right to defend yourself. I respect that you didn't try to humiliate us after you won. A lot of guys would have." Ethan studied Blake's face, looking for signs of deception or lingering hostility. What he saw instead was genuine remorse and something that might have been relief. Blake Harrison, stripped of his followers and his reputation for invincibility, looked like what he had probably always been underneath the carefully constructed persona, a scared teenager who had used violence and intimidation to mask his own insecurities. "Just leave people alone from now on," Ethan said finally. "Find something better to do with your time." Blake nodded eagerly. "Yeah, absolutely. We're done with all that stuff. I mean it." As Blake walked away, moving carefully and clearly still in considerable pain, Ethan reflected on Uncle Ray's words about consequences and choices. The confrontation had been necessary, but more importantly, it had been controlled. He hadn't let anger or revenge guide his actions. He had simply done what needed to be done to end a bad situation. The transformation in Roosevelt High's social dynamics over the following weeks was remarkable. Students who had been targets of harassment began walking taller, speaking up more in class, reclaiming spaces they had previously avoided. The unspoken understanding that bullying would be tolerated had been shattered, replaced by a new awareness that actions had consequences. Ethan returned to his preferred state of relative anonymity, but now it was a choice rather than a necessity. Students respected his desire for privacy while also recognizing that he wasn't someone to be trifled with. Teachers who had previously overlooked him began engaging him more actively in class discussions, perhaps sensing the quiet confidence that had replaced his former invisibility. The experience had taught him something important about the difference between avoiding conflict and accepting abuse. Uncle Ray had been right. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to show them that there were consequences for their actions. But it was equally important to know when to stop, when justice had been served without crossing the line into revenge. As he settled into his new equilibrium at Roosevelt High School, Ethan carried with him the satisfaction of knowing he had stood up for himself without losing who he was. The quiet kid was still quiet, but now everyone understood that his silence was a choice, not a weakness. And sometimes that made all the difference in the world. Epilogue. 6 months later, spring had arrived at Roosevelt High School, bringing with it the kind of crisp, clear weather that made Oregon's long, gray winters seem like a distant memory. Ethan Cross sat in his usual spot in the courtyard, the same space where his confrontation with Blake Harrison and Connor Mills had taken place 6 months earlier. But now he was there by choice rather than necessity. A chemistry textbook lay open in his lap as he reviewed for the advanced placement exam that would determine whether he could skip introductory chemistry in college. The courtyard had become a very different place since that October afternoon. Students who had once eaten lunch in isolated corners or hidden in the library now occupied tables throughout the space, their conversations animated and free from the undercurrent of fear that had previously defined social interactions at the school. The change wasn't just cosmetic. According to Maya Chen, who had become something like the school's unofficial social anthropologist, reported incidents of bullying had dropped by more than 60% since the previous fall. "Mind if I join you?" Ethan looked up to see David Chen approaching with his own stack of AP review materials. Maya's older brother had become something of a friend over the past several months, one of the few students who seemed to understand that Ethan's reputation for quiet intensity didn't make him antisocial or dangerous. "Sure," Ethan replied, making room at the picnic table. "Studying for the economics exam?" "Among other things," David said, settling beside him and spreading out his notes. "Though I have to admit, I'm having trouble concentrating on supply and demand curves when there's so much other stuff happening around here." He gestured toward the main building, where students were already putting up posters and banners for the upcoming spring formal. It was the kind of normal teenage activity that had seemed impossible during the height of Blake and Connor's reign of intimidation, when any public display of enthusiasm or creativity was likely to attract unwanted attention from their crew. "Maya told me you turned down another invitation to run for student council," David continued, his tone carefully neutral. Ethan nodded, not looking up from his textbook. Jessica Martinez and her allies had been persistently trying to recruit him for various leadership roles throughout the spring semester, arguing that his reputation and influence could be channeled into positive change through official channels. But Ethan had consistently declined, preferring to maintain the low profile that had always suited him best. "Not interested in politics," he said simply. "Fair enough," David replied, "though you might be interested to know that Blake Harrison is apparently planning to run for senior class president next year." That got Ethan's attention. He looked up from his chemistry notes with surprise and what might have been concern. "Really? I thought he was keeping a low profile these days." "He has been," David confirmed. But according to Maya, who heard it from Sarah Williams, who apparently got it from Jessica Martinez, Blake's been working with the school counselors on some kind of anti-bullying initiative. Wants to use his experience as both a perpetrator and a victim to help other students avoid making the same mistakes he did. Ethan considered this information carefully. In the months since their confrontation, Blake had indeed kept his word about leaving other students alone. He and Connor had effectively disappeared from the social hierarchy that had once elevated them to positions of power and influence. Blake attended classes, did his homework, and avoided drawing attention to himself, the same strategy Ethan had originally tried to employ when he first arrived at Roosevelt High. "Think it's genuine?" Ethan asked. David shrugged. "Hard to say. People can change, especially when they've been forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Or maybe he's just figured out that being known as the guy who got his ass kicked by the new kid isn't the foundation for a successful political campaign." They studied in comfortable silence for several minutes, surrounded by the normal sounds of a high school at peace with itself. Students talked and laughed without constantly looking over their shoulders. Teachers moved through the space without the hypervigilance that had once been necessary to prevent incidents of harassment or violence. The atmosphere was lighter, more relaxed, more conducive to the kind of learning and growth that schools were supposed to foster. "Can I ask you something?" David said eventually. "Sure." "Do you ever regret what happened? The fight, I mean. The way everything changed after that?" Ethan closed his textbook and leaned back against the table, considering the question seriously. It was something he had thought about many times over the past 6 months, particularly during phone conversations with Uncle Ray, who always asked probing questions about how he was handling the social consequences of his actions. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret that the adults in this building were either unable or unwilling to address the problem before it escalated to violence. I regret that Blake and Connor felt the need to build their social status on the systematic humiliation of other people." "But you don't regret defending yourself?" "No," Ethan said without hesitation, "and I don't regret the fact that other students feel safer because of what happened. If Blake really is planning to run for student council on an anti-bullying platform, then maybe something good came out of all of it." A comfortable silence settled between them as they returned to their studying. The spring sun was warm on Ethan's shoulders, and he found himself thinking about the future with something approaching optimism. In a few months, he would graduate from Roosevelt High and head to college, leaving behind the social hierarchies and petty cruelties that had defined his teenage years. But he would also be leaving behind the friends he had made and the community he had inadvertently helped to create. Maya appeared at their table a few minutes later, carrying a lunch tray and wearing the kind of excited expression that usually meant she had discovered something interesting in her ongoing study of the school's social dynamics. "You guys are not going to believe what I just heard," she announced, settling beside her brother and immediately launching into what was clearly going to be a detailed report. "Connor Mills just asked Stephanie Rodriguez to the spring formal," she said, pausing for dramatic effect. David raised an eyebrow. "The Stephanie Rodriguez who runs the peer tutoring program? The one who Connor used to torment for being a nerd?" "The very same," Maya confirmed. "And according to Stephanie, who told her best friend Amanda, who told me, Connor actually apologized for his previous behavior and asked if she would consider giving him a chance to prove he had changed." Ethan found himself smiling despite his general skepticism about teenage romance. Stephanie Rodriguez was one of the students who had been most visibly affected by the change in Roosevelt High's social climate. Previously quiet and defensive, she had blossomed into a confident leader who organized study groups and volunteered for community service projects. If Connor Mills was genuinely interested in dating her, It suggested a significant shift in his values and priorities. "Think she said yes?" David asked. "She said she'd think about it," Maya replied, which is probably the most positive response Connor could have hoped for, considering their history. As Maya launched into a more detailed analysis of the social implications of Connor's apparent reformation, Ethan found himself reflecting on the unpredictable nature of human change. 6 months ago, the idea that Connor Mills would be nervously asking out a girl he had previously bullied would have seemed absurd. Now, it was apparently reality. One more piece of evidence that the confrontation in the courtyard had set in motion changes that were still rippling through the school's social ecosystem. His phone buzzed with a text message from Uncle Ray. "How's school treating you these days, champ?" Ethan smiled as he typed his response. "Much better. Thanks for the advice." The reply came almost immediately. "That's what uncles are for. Proud of you, kid. You handled a tough situation the right way." As the lunch period ended and students began making their way back to afternoon classes, Ethan gathered his books and prepared to navigate the final months of his junior year. The halls that had once felt like a gauntlet now felt manageable, even comfortable. Students nodded respectfully as he passed, but without the mixture of fear and fascination that had marked his interactions immediately after the fight. He had become what he had always wanted to be, just another student, working hard and looking forward to graduation. The difference was that now his anonymity was a choice rather than a defense mechanism, and his quiet confidence was recognized and respected rather than mistaken for weakness. As he took his seat in AP Physics and prepared for a discussion of momentum and energy conservation, Ethan couldn't help but appreciate the irony. He had learned more about physics from his confrontation with Blake and Connor than from any textbook. Force, mass, acceleration, and the conservation of energy had all played crucial roles in that 2-minute encounter that had changed everything. But perhaps the most important lesson had nothing to do with physics or martial arts. It was Uncle Ray's wisdom about the difference between strength and violence, between protecting yourself and seeking revenge, between standing up for what's right and simply proving how tough you are. Sometimes, Ethan reflected as his teacher began the lesson, the quietest person in the room was also the strongest. And sometimes, when everything else failed, quiet strength was exactly what the situation required. The afternoon sun streamed through the classroom windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny fighters engaged in their own invisible battles. Ethan opened his notebook, prepared to learn about the forces that governed the physical world, secure in the knowledge that he had already mastered the more complex forces that governed the social one. Outside, in the courtyard where it all began, students continued to eat their lunches in peace, unaware that their freedom had been purchased with 2 minutes of controlled violence and 8 years of disciplined training. But that was exactly how Ethan preferred it, quietly effective, and with consequences that spoke louder than words ever could. In the end, that was the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the best way to change the world was to simply refuse to let it change you. And sometimes, when someone pushed too hard for too long, the quiet kid turned out to be exactly the person they should have been most afraid of all along. The story was over, but the legend would endure. At Roosevelt High School, students would continue to whisper about the day the new kid proved that silence wasn't weakness, that discipline wasn't passivity, and that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to show them what real strength looked like. And in the end, everyone learned that the most dangerous fighter was often the one who never wanted to fight at all.